Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Rukas, and I would like to welcome you to Module 1 in Police and Society. Um, in this module, I am going to talk to you about the history of policing and also give you some information on the course. Like many processes, policing is something that has evolved over time, but I want to give you a few concepts that we can use to introduce this. First of all, we need to take a look at law because law and law enforcement are two peas in a pod. First, we have to keep in mind that there are two types of social control. The first type of social control is informal social control, and this is the kind of social control we get from friends and relatives. Rather than something telling us an action is right or wrong, what informal social control does is rather than putting it in writing, it's just something you know. For example, think of times when you were a teenager and maybe you violated a curfew. No, that wasn't a written law, but your parents probably very well made it be known that you had disobeyed a norm. Or think of it when you do something that people don't like and they ignore you. That's informal social control. Formal social control, on the other hand, is things that are put into law. And those are areas of society where people have come to think that behavior is so bad that it warrants some type of official enforcement mechanism and that informal social control is insufficient. Now, formal control can be enforced in a number of different ways, but always the meat of any form of formal social control is the fact that law enforcement, in some size, shape, or form, has the ability to be in the center of it. Now, there's one other concept that becomes very important here, because as a function, as an agent of social control, which is what police are, they enforce the law. They don't make it, which sometimes causes tensions because often a law will be unpopular. Well, not often, but there are times when a law can be unpopular, and even an officer doesn't agree with the law, but because of the fact the officer doesn't make the law, the officer still needs to enforce it. And this can create problems, especially with issues of social justice, where the law enforcement officer becomes the face of the law, even though the law enforcement officer doesn't have the power to make the law. And that's just something I want you to keep in mind as we go throughout the course. Now, with that, let me start with some history. Policing, as we know it, developed after the Dark Ages. Rome had fallen, and Rome actually had a form of policing, but it didn't have a formal police force. At that point, policing was by and large a function of the army, and the military handled it. After Rome fell, civilization kind of crumbled, and we have the Dark Ages. And where instead we're working with countries during this 500-year period, yeah, it was about 500 years, we developed a system known as feudalism. And feudalism was a survival system. You would have a rich landowner, and then you would have people that would work the land. So as a result, the people that had the power and the people that needed the formal control were the landowners on which people farmed and got their food, and of course paid a tribute through taxes to the landowner. The system that evolved, and this was not something it didn't start out formal, was a system called Frank Pledge. And what Frank Pledge did was a self-policing system where 9 people all policed each other. And they were responsible for the acts that everyone else did. So because I was responsible for the act of my neighbor, I often made sure that my neighbor obeyed the law. All right? This further developed as society got into the Renaissance period, but there were also people that were overlooking the Frank Pledges as well, so that there were various divisions that were developed. The first formal policing department we see is with the British and in the 13 colonies. At that point, we started to see growth, and these small little individual systems weren't working. And the fact of the matter is, if I was going to be responsible for what my neighbor did, in a society that's supposedly democratic and supposed to be focusing on independence, this didn't sit well. So what happened was there was the appointment of a senior law enforcement officer, which was the sheriff. Now, the duties entailed law enforcement, all right? And normally the sheriff had responsibility for law enforcement over a certain area. What is important here is to note that the law enforcement officer was not elected. As a result, we didn't have independence. The sheriff was someone that was appointed by the governor that was in charge of the area. Now, in bigger cities at the time, such as New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, we start seeing the fact that it's too much, the population is such that it's too much for a sheriff. So as a result, there would be sub-sheriffs that were appointed, and these would be noted as constables and night watchmen. Now, as the country grew, particularly after we broke away from Great Britain, we start seeing police forces where we have multiple people developing, and their responsibility is to basically keep law and order in the area in which they're done. Again, because it became impossible to watch what everybody was doing, you needed more and more people to keep doing the enforcement. What's important here, though, is that even though we had more people, the sheriff was still appointed either by a governor or a mayor. As a result, instead of enforcing law as it was written on the books, many times the governor or a mayor would use police to get back at their enemies, and there was selective law enforcement. This form of policing was mostly during the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, but what characterizes it more than focusing on keeping law and order, it was more of a system of corruption, and many times there were grafts and bribes that were paid in order. Police were used as a weapon. You didn't want to upset someone in high power, otherwise you might have the police put on you who were enforcing all these laws. Technology changes all that, and also important is the reformer movement, which started at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. People became very, very tired of the single figure focused nature of the city and wanted more voice from the people, which is something we didn't find during the 1800s. So the reform movement brings something that's really important and an issue of accountability. Police become an independent arm of government, and we see two divisions that start being elected by the public. We see the sheriff, who was the senior law enforcement official in the community. That sheriff needs to stand for election, and as a result becomes accountable to the people that he or she, at that point in time, he was policing. We also see the same thing happening with judges. While this has never happened on the federal level, and that to many is an issue of consternation, on the local level, our judges are elected, and they're elected so that they can keep accountability to the people that they're serving. Now, one other element that we have to keep in mind is how technology dramatically changed policing. We have three things that developed at the beginning of the 1900s that would characterize policing until today, but technology keeps developing. The first of which was the radio. The radio gave police the ability to communicate with each other, so it wasn't one officer, and more importantly, we were able to do calls for service, all right? Important with this also, at about the same time, we start to see the invention of the telephone. So what this invention allowed people to do was to call a police department. The police department could then radio an officer to come and help something in assistance and work the law. Around the 1920s and 1930s, we see the police moving from walking to the beat into squad cars. Now, many will consider squad cars to be a technological improvement that should be celebrated because it gave police the ability to look at larger areas and respond to more people. There's a criticism of this, though, and that is that at many times police weren't as integrated in the community. They were kind of siloed in their cars, which many feel was not necessarily a good thing. And finally, toward the end of the 20th century, we see the development of the computer, which allows things like crime mapping and, more importantly, to do on-the-spot checks to verify personal identities and look at personal criminal records. With that, I think I've given you enough background. All right? Now, I want to give you an idea of how this course is going to work. First of all assignments are due Friday. And I debate on this, whether these things should be on Fridays or Sundays. But I have found that Fridays work better because what it does is it gives you more time to do the last week of the course. Now, those of you that prefer to work on weekends, the First of all, I don't load a lot of, there's not a lot of course material that's required of the first week. As a result, it lets you get into the course. Then if you work the weekends, you can just work the weekend before the Friday that it's due. This course is going to have 3 elements, all right? First, 3 elements as far as your grading goes. The first of which are reflections. Reflections are for each reading that you do, and this will go throughout the course. You'll need to write 2 paragraphs on each reading or chapter of a reading, all right? Toward the end, like for the Gilmartin readings, I'll specify that you have 2 reflections due, and they should be 2 paragraphs each. The first paragraph should summarize the information, and the second is to give your opinion on it. The reason I put these in is I just want to make sure you do the readings. Also, throughout the course, there will be essays. The essays need to be between 550 and 800 words, and the goal of this is to integrate both class lectures from these slides, as well as readings into an argument about a contemporary article. Now, the articles I choose for these should elicit some sort of reaction because I choose them for that purpose. And also, more importantly, I choose these articles because I want them to be timely and contemporary and realize what you're doing. And last but not least, and this is going to be a substantial component of your grade, it's going to be your final project. Your first part of the project will be due this week. You need to choose a topic for a term paper, and it can be anything that's related to policing. You have three other parts of the project. There'll be an annotated bibliography, where you'll need to get sources. I'll talk about that more as we get going on it. You need a rough draft of your paper, and then finally, the last day of class, I'll have a final paper due. So, for this week, semester project part 1, I just want to remind you, this is probably the easiest number of points that you're going to get. Make sure you enter the topic for your semester project. With that, I hope you learn a lot in this course, and I look forward to working with you. Have a good one. Bye.